The Industrial Revolution had many other effects than simply great innovations and great changes. It also has more effects than just changing the way of life, the way we move goods and people, and the way we communicate. One of these other big changes is immigrants. With the rise of industrialization, millions of people start flooding into America in search of what we call the American dream. And the American dream is this idea that you can start with nothing at all and rise up to really make something out of yourself. It's kind of this idea that if you work hard, good things will happen for you. So millions of people are going to come into our country searching for wealth and jobs in a way to better their lives. Between 1820 and 1900, which is the time period we're talking about now, more than 5 million Irish and German immigrants are going to come to America. Many of the Irish that come here are going to come because of the Irish potato famine. With no food in Ireland, they come in America in search of food and money. Another group of immigrants that comes a little bit later on in the 1840s all the way through 1890 is about 1 million Chinese and Japanese immigrants. They're going to come to the western part of our country. And they're going to live in places mostly like California, and they're going to be the main source of labor for that transcontinental railroad that we've talked about. So one thing I like to ask you to think about is, was there really an American dream? For most immigrants, when they came here, the only housing available were things called tenements. And tenements were very similar to slums. This picture taken here, this is of a tenement. A tenement is basically a very cheap / poor apartment. And you can see in this picture, there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 men sleeping in this small crowded space in this tenement. And most of them had multiple families living in what today we would only have one family living in. These would have multiple families. Most of them only had one bathroom for the entire apartment floor, so that all of these families had to share it. So they were pretty nasty conditions to live in. You can see that this is an example of the outside of tenements. They were very close together. People did their laundry from hanging out the windows. You can see that there was no backyards, no places for kids to play, that it was very dirty and grimy. It was just not a great living situation when you got over here. Education has always been something America has prided itself on, and a lot of immigrants were really excited that their kids would get an education. But to get an education in America, that often meant you had to assimilate. And assimilate means that you have to give up your culture to become a part of the American culture. So oftentimes what was expected at school is that you dressed like an American, you spoke and wrote in English. Many times you were forced to give up your religion to practice some form of Christianity. So it was very traumatic to a lot of immigrants that they were expected to move over here and kind of lose a part of themselves. Also, many immigrants were viewed as unwelcome. You can see that this is a sign from a Chinese Exclusion Act. And many people viewed immigrants as stealing jobs from Americans, because a lot of immigrants would work for a lot cheaper than Americans would. So there was a lot of hatred and tension towards immigrants from Americans that existed in our country. On top of all of this, so on top of poor living conditions, on top of having to give up your own culture, on top of not being wanted in a lot of scenarios, factory working conditions were really poor. And Americans would also work in these factories. So this is kind of a broad category that immigrants and Americans worked in them, but the factory conditions were very poor. You can see and hear that this is a massive factory with people crammed right next to each other, very few windows for ventilation. There wouldn't have been heating and air conditioning. It was a 6-day work week, so you would work Monday through Saturday. The only day you would get off is Sunday. Most days where you were expected to work anywhere between 10 and 15 hours. So you're pulling 60, 70, 80-hour work weeks, and you're making pennies an hour. So very little money for how hard you're working. Also, there were no child labor laws. So you can see in this picture 8, 6, 7, 9, and 10-year-olds working. And in a lot of factories, children were actually the preferred source of labor. You could pay children less, and also their fingers were a lot smaller to get into some of those crowded areas in the machines. So as we get more immigrants and as we get this industrial revolution continuing, a new trend is going to happen. People are going to leave the farmlands that they grew up on, and they're going to move into cities. So as people immigrated to America and moved off the farms and into cities, more problems are going to be created. And these are just the problems that you get inside of a city. You're going to have a lot more pollution from the machines and from the factories. And pollution would have not been regulated back then because we didn't know what it did to the environment. You can see in this picture alone that you can't even see, the rest of the city because of how bad the smog is. It's also going to be extremely overcrowded. Many of these cities are going to be built up overnight, and they're not going to be able to handle the larger populations. Anywhere where there's lots of people, there's going to be higher disease. And we don't have the ability to take care of disease back then that we do now. People weren't clean and hygienic, and they didn't wash their hands. And so if someone in your city is sick, it's going to spread very quickly. Anywhere you have lots of people, especially lots of people in poor economic situations, you're going to have an increase in crime. You're also going to have a problem because these factories are just going to produce products, and there's going to be no regulation as to the status of the products. So one company that's canning food might include a lot of ingredients in the food that we would think of as being really, really nasty today because there was nobody to look out for that kind of stuff. So these are just some of the things that arise with cities. And one of the last things that we're going to kind of look at is how the Industrial Revolution changes each section in our country. So the first thing we're going to look at is that the gap between the North and South is only going to grow wider. That's because the North is going to take off with industry. They are going to be firm believers in industry. They are going to have factories, multiple factories in every city. Cities are going to take over places like New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh. Huge, massive cities are going to rise up with factories. They are going to love the constant change. There will literally be new technology daily, and they're going to just run with it. Kind of similar to how there's always a new social media that's cool these days. That's how technology was back then. So there was always a new machine or a new way to do something faster, and they were going to just go with it, and they're going to love business and love industry. In fact, they're going to love business so much that their governments are going to be geared to protecting business. So they're going to make laws and taxes that really favor the companies. So for instance, they're not going to make child labor laws, and their taxes, they're going to heavily tax exports because they're making the goods, and they want to make money on those. So that's what's happening in the North. The South is completely different. The invention that we talked about, the most important invention, the cotton gin, is going to change every single way of life. Before the cotton gin, there were slaves. There were just under 1 million. But after the cotton gin, there are 2.5 million slaves. Slavery is going to be the way of life in the South because it's the only way you can pick the cotton fast enough to get it to the cotton gin. Instead of moving to cities and factories and industry, Agriculture is going to be huge in the South. Everything is going to be, I need more land so that I can produce more cotton. And I need more slaves so that I can produce more cotton. Because they are only focused on farms, they can't make anything at all for themselves. And they have to import almost everything. So we're talking about tools and clothes and machines and goods. They have to import everything because all of their land and resources are being geared towards cotton. In fact, cotton becomes so important in the South, it's referred to as king cotton. So the North and South were already driving themselves apart, and the Industrial Revolution just drives them further to where now they hardly have anything in common. The Industrial Revolution doesn't just change the North and the South. It also is going to change the West. It's going to make it way faster and safer to get there. We're no longer going to be going on covered wagons. We're eventually now going to be able to get there in trains. It's going to be easier to keep in contact. We've got the Pony Express, we have the telegraph. And innovations are just going to help the West grow. So they're not going to go through this like underdeveloped time that the North and the South went through. Once it gets settled, it's going to be cities pretty much right away. So the Industrial Revolution really changes our country. And the things that you need to take home from this lecture is that it changes three main things. It changes the way we move people and goods, so transportation. It changes the way we communicate with things like the telegraph and the Pony Express. And it changes how we live. We're no longer in the North living in farms. We're in cities, and we have factories, and we have machines. We're not hand making goods and clothing anymore. We're relying on machines to make things for us. Also, the most important invention for you to take home is going to be the cotton gin. That you just cannot underemphasize how important the cotton gin is in changing our country's history. And kind of the final message of the Industrial Revolution is it's going to take the sectionalism already present in our country, and it's going to drive the North and South even further apart. So those are your really big take-home messages on the Industrial Revolution. Thanks for listening.